Welcome, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. My name is Sarah Saltzer, and I'm the Managing Director of the Stanford Center for Carbon Storage. As we all know, successful CCS projects aren't just about good science and engineering. Just as important are things like public perception and interest group agendas. This is the reason for today's webinar entitled, How to Have Better Conversations About Carbon. Our speaker is John Davies, the chairman and CEO of Davies Public Affairs. John is one of the most respected communication strategists and an expert on public persuasion. He's spent his life studying how to earn the public's attention for the issues and causes that his clients care about. This pursuit has been to understand how we learn, what captures our attention, how we are persuaded, and what motivates us to act. He brings over 4 decades of experience addressing many of the most emotional and important issues in the public lexicon, especially around energy sources, generation, and infrastructure. John, welcome to the SCCS webinar series, and thank you for speaking with us today. John is going to deliver a 30-minute presentation. We ask that you hold your questions until the end when we'll open things up for Q&A. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Sarah. What an honor to present to your group and be with your group. I know last year I was able to attend a session at the university, and it was such a productive day, such a productive conversation, and hope that we can carry on. A lot of what I got out of there relates to what I want to talk about today. And that is that the common sense conversations about carbon are not all that common. The decarbonization conversations are being squeezed from both sides. Unlike most issues, both sides of the issue, and sometimes what does the both sides mean is what it is. One side is saying that it's a fraud. One side is saying that it's a waste. Groups are coming out with numbers. People are coming on and attacking the companies that they love. And they're going after it because they don't want it to happen from one point or the other. And it's being squeezed and being pushed in many places. It's just crashing. So how we talk about carbon really matters. And the deal is, any conversation today in the public, trying to engage people, trying to persuade, has to start with listening. We need to listen first, and we need to listen better. And that's what I want to start with. So carbon capture and storage projects we're doing around the country. We are able to build trust by listening first, by really understanding what they have to say. And we'll talk a little bit how that works. It's funny that we're always asked immediately, well, to do 2 things. One is we need talking points, and we need myths and facts. And we actually need neither of those. What we need are listening points. What do we need to listen to first? What questions do we need to know? What is the public thinking about this? But most of all, what are their dreams and what are their fears? And fears being most important because that's what drives them. So listening first, we're able to know what others think and what they feel. And we're not telling them what we think. They don't really care what we think. It's about them. So I'm going to go through this in a little bit of detail near the end. But these are the steps we take as we reach out. So listen. We want to target our audiences. We want to know who we're talking to and how they feel about things. Are they really attentive and outraged at something? Are they inattentive and just fearful? And then with that, we can craft compelling stories and how to reach. We got to share those stories. I don't know how many places we've gone where people have given us all this great material they produced and they don't know why it doesn't work as well. They just share it with anyone. And then we need to cultivate relationships. We have people that'll support us, but will they become an advocate? And we need to transition them by cultivating relationships. And last, we need to activate those advocates to take a stand. And that's a very, very careful step-by-step program. We'll share a teeny bit about that today. But first, how do we listen best? And this isn't a seminar about listening. I'm not going to make you talk about your listening skills. But looking at public opinion polling, the strength is it's one-on-one. The weakness is there's closed-end questions. And so we ask questions without knowing what we don't know, and we don't get all the answers. So we need to figure out what we really need to do. And so that's where focus groups are always good. The strength is it's closed end, who, where, what, why, and how. And the challenge is, its weakness is its groupthink. You put 8, 10, 12 people around the table, and someone always dominates. Someone always takes over. You really don't get to hear each individual. So we've taken that and turned it into a really simple method anyone on this webinar today can do. One-on-one on the phones, because people talk more on the phones than they do face-to-face with you taking notes, and open-ended. And just have a conversation with them. We have a method of creating the instrument that we use for the interviews. And we also have a method of allowing people to lead us, and they stay on the phone 45 minutes to an hour and able to go through that. Okay, there is a time, though, the public opinion polling, the one-on-one really matters. And that's when we're looking at a larger area and a big number of people. So a national study is hard to do with one-on-one focused interviews. So this is from the summer and fall, where we annually do an energy seminar or an energy study around the country. This was with 1,000 people. And I'm going to show just a little bit of the results. So we asked people from the following list of sources of energy by industry, which one? Please answer if you have a positive or negative perception of that one. So positive is all we're looking at now because the numbers are so crazy high. And this is pretty consistent over the years, where we're looking at solar and wind being really high, but also natural gas being high. And this will change by region of the country, the natural gas and the solar and wind. Solar and wind will drop in some more red states, but not a lot. And natural gas will drop in some more environmentally minded states, but not a lot. I mean, in California, our studies has natural gas at the mid-50s, such as battery storage. So that tells us how to go forward. So the Northeast, the Southeast, and the West Coast differ greatly on how they feel about carbon capture. And therefore, we have to approach them differently. We got to talk about what their fears are, but also what their dreams are, what they want to get out of carbon capture, why that matters to them. And clearly, the Northeast and West Coast are worried about climate concerns. The Southeast and Midwest support based on the ability to continue to use natural gas. In many ways, if you're doing this on a power plant, that's what they will support it if that's what you're doing with it. And so one of the things that we have found that most people trying to talk about carbon capture and storage is they're afraid to talk about CO2. And for that, we need to get a lesson from dihydrogen monoxide. There was a disaster, and I don't know if many of you saw the disaster, but a group of disc jockeys always did an April Fool's joke in this one community, and they got people all fired up, and it was always looked forward to. But one year they talked about dihydrogen monoxide, and it led to this incredible small scale panic where people were like going out of their mind. And they got serious hot water. They were taken off the air for a time period. There was a panic because they joked about the water quality, saying dihydrogen monoxide was coming out of residents' taps. And some people were going to the hospital thinking they were sick. So we must talk about carbon if we're talking about CCS. There's no reason not to. Not talking about it makes it very scary. I mean, when we see the illustrations of if it being sequestered or stored, and there's little CO2s going across in this pipe and going underground, it has to be scary. And we need to talk about it. And an example of how we've talked about it, I'm not going to do the sound on this, but being able to just look at it, looking at the carbon cycle, sharing it a little bit in presentations and in booklets. The idea, this is where the CO2 comes from and what happens to it. Well, the CO2 is taken up by a lot of plants. That's why, and it becomes an organic part of the process and releases O2. And today, this goes on. Today, we have an imbalance of CO2, and we need to balance it. And that is what gets taken advantage of by some groups who, well, they have great intentions of wanting to have a cleaner environment. They want to knock out anything with fossil fuels. So every piece of fossil fuel infrastructure will have to be contested. And you can read the rest of this from the founder of 350.org. I mean, and that's what we face. And the problem is when it's hard to communicate, we tend not to communicate. And therefore, we leave it to others to do so. We leave it to others to tell our story. And the others usually are people that have a bone to pick one way or the other, and they're not best at telling our story. If you look at Food and Water Watch now, this is one of their biggest issues. We see them all over the country, the carbon capture scam. Fossil fuel executives hope you believe in the new scheme. Great PR words. They want you to think CCS will save our climate, but it won't. What they're selling the public is snake oil to lull consumers into thinking there's an easier fix than any fossil fuel use. So take action, educate, organize, protect. And if you're trying to put forward a CCS project and doing something in a very responsible manner, this is what you're going to face. And therefore, we need to do the same when we're talking to people about a project. We need to get out there, educate. So an approach that I'd like to share today and unpack a little bit, not a lot with the short time we have, is creating a value-based message. Our challenge a lot of times is that we share a financial message about these things. And, especially in renewable energy, so much of the renewable energy projects we come in to try to rescue, talking about tax revenue and jobs. Well, people aren't going to give up their quality of life for a job or for tax revenue. And the industry that is most likely that it's all about jobs and revenue is tobacco industry, because there's not a lot of other things they can talk about. Where renewable, you can talk a lot of things, and in CCS you can talk about. So let's unpack these a little bit. So acknowledge is our first step. Then we contrast, then we embrace, then we bridge to the economics. So we acknowledge and accept there are impacts. There's always going to be an impact when we're doing something, and we admit it. We contrast the impacts of acting with greater impact of not acting. And how does that fit? Carbon capture and storage, the contrast of acting with not acting. It's so much better. And then we embrace the benefits, and then we bridge to the economic message. And so let's acknowledge just a little bit. We're not going to get to do all these. So when you're doing this, you're creating integrity, you're creating credibility. One of the best people in the world about doing this is Warren Buffett. And agonizing over errors is a mistake, but acknowledging and analyzing them can be useful. Though that project is rare in corporate boardrooms, but it's not rare with Warren Buffett. This is one of his great things. Self-criticism has served him well. Dear shareholder, I'm sorry. Investors await his annual letter, and they look at some of his many apologies. He gets out there to do it. The other part about this is when you're trying to talk about pros and cons, you build so much credibility when you talk about cons and pros. It's a game changer when you're presenting something to someone. You're saying this is why we shouldn't do something. This is why you should look into it before you say why we should do it. That's instant credibility. So this letter is the best example of it, and it's a redo from a book called Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. In his book, it's a 2-page letter. So this is to Reverend and Victoria Lewis. The subject is Christmas. Dear Mom and Dad, sure hope you are well. I miss you. Sadly, I won't be coming home for Christmas. I'm leaving for Nepal tomorrow. The thing is, I'm pregnant. My boyfriend is from Nepal. We're going to meet his parents. They live close to the Himalaya mountains. You're often taught tolerance and love for others will mean you accept him as a Buddhist and me as a convert. Love you both, Jenny. But P.S. I'm not pregnant. I don't have a boyfriend, nor am I converting or moving to Nepal. But I did not do very well my first semester of college. I failed calculus and world history and got C's in the other classes and wanted you to see those grades with a better perspective. Now, Jenny's a genius at persuasion because she took a pretty horrible situation and contrasted it with a situation that the reality she probably was going to be in trouble with. And so Jenny's a genius at this. So she's acknowledging and contrasting. And the challenge is when we are doing things like this, we do it just the opposite. Most projects that we work on or come into, they do it just the opposite. Bridge, embrace, contrast, and acknowledge. And what it really becomes is it's a promise, it's a spin, it's a complain and a confess. And so we promise the jobs in economics. We spin the concepts of the project with only benefits. We point out how unfair the opposition acts, and then we'll admit at some point there's impacts. And every step of this method of going out and trying to create a conversation with people, we end up losing support and credibility. When you do it the opposite, it's so much better. And so once you get through that and you're putting together that message based on that, you then you have this program to do first impressions. And as the great old junior league quote, that you only get one chance to make a first impression. So we look at these 6 steps to make a first impression and follow through. And they're pretty straightforward steps. I always put John Wooden here when I talk about these, is because when John Wooden would meet a new class coming in at UCLA's freshman class, and he would meet them, he would come into the gym, and all these great players always talk about it. Come into the gym, they're all shooting around. They're so excited. The greatest basketball coach in history. They're playing for the greatest team. And Wooden comes in and goes, boys, let's come into the center here. Okay, boys, I want you to take your shoes and socks off, because I want to show you how to put your socks on so you don't get blisters. I want to show you how to put your shoes on and tie them so they don't come off in a game and you get hurt. And so pretty basics. And that's what he was. He was a coach of basics, and he taught basics. And this is exactly what this is. These are some pretty basic steps. We already talked about listen first. Next, we need to target our audiences. And we're not going to go into any more detail than this on this, unfortunately, in the short time. But who are we talking to? I mean, what are the people that we must talk to? So we need to identify them. And what are the people interested in? As I said before, some people are just really attentive and they're just totally outraged. And if we keep trying to persuade them, they're going to get more outraged and crazier. What we need to do with them is we need to go listen to them and let them yell at us. We need to let them get the steam off. We need to let them get outraged, and then we can start having a conversation. For those who have fears, the fears they normally have, they have a fear of being unknown, of what we're doing is unknown, which is pretty true with carbon capture and storage. And we got to deal with that. And then they're scared about change. Any change scares them. And last, a very unique fear that is part of our society today is the fear of being insignificant. We got to make people significant. So people that are leaders in a community, we need to talk to them. Because if they're leaders in the community and we're not talking to them, they have this fear of being insignificant and they're going to be angry. Next, we need to craft very compelling stories. And it is stories. We need to do stories. And stories are very simple. There's always a great line that I always get, I don't have enough time to do a story. I only have a few minutes. And so the best example is headline, "The King and Queen Died." Fact. The Queen died, and then the king died of a broken heart. That's a story. That's a difference. And you can do stories just as quickly. You just have to be very careful how you do it. And then once you have a story, you got to share the story. That means you got to get it out to those targeted audience. You got to follow up, and you got to get it places. And it doesn't have to be 1,000 things. It doesn't have to be some massive social media campaign, although we really suggest a digital campaign, but it does not have to be a massive social media campaign where you end up in fights. So next, you collect some people who say, I'm with you. I really want to do this. And then you want to cultivate a relationship. This is where you take a strong supporter who may be like a Facebook friend. They click on, and do they stay with you? No. So you want to cultivate support into advocates and get them to be advocates. And you do that by meeting with them, talking to them, keeping them up to date, having some small groups where you get to be with them. And then last, you want to activate them. And activate them is a step-by-step program where you're reaching out to them, you let them know what's happening, you let them know why you need them and how they can participate. And then you can have people talking on your side. So that's the 6 steps. And I got a couple other things I want to do in the last few minutes we have before questions. You know, everyone's got to love Teddy Roosevelt. And I absolutely love this quote because I think I've had to walk around with not being able to sit down for a month. If you could kick the person in the pants responsible for most of your trouble, you wouldn't be able to sit for a month. And I think that represents a lot of us when we're trying to get through things in this industry. And the reason that we couldn't sit for a month is we're not reaching out and talking to people. We're thinking that they're just going to know. And so as we go to do that, we're doing this outreach, and it's all about trust today. And to earn trust in this world, we must engage. And trust has changed so much. I mean, if we're in a room together, I'd ask how many of you have been to Airbnb. And in the room, it would be like 70, 80% of you raise your hand. I'd ask how many of you invested in Bitcoin or played with Bitcoin. And there'd be a few of you raise your hand. And then I'd ask you if you've ever participated in Tinder. And a few brave people would raise their hand. And all of these, along with others, are an example of distributed trust, how we've changed the world, how we trust different institutions, how we keep track of trust. And it's distributed trust. So one of the most interesting one, I am not even sure if they're still around right now, but is BlaBlaCar. It started in France and sort of a play off the colleges in the 80s and 90s, maybe early 2000s, where there'd be a ride board and you put on the ride board, going home this weekend to Chicago, and anyone need a ride, share gas money. And people would take a little piece off it and you'd share gas money. And so this is someone doing it on an app, and you share costs. There's a fee to do it. And so, but they want to qualify one another. Do I really want to drive across France with someone? And some of the qualifications are, do you smoke? How loud do you play your music? And are you bringing a pet? Big questions, all pretty minor, and making a decision. The biggest concern that they discovered that people want to know about driving across the country with you is, how much do you talk? So are you going to be a block car? Are you going to be a blah blah car? Are you going to be a blah 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 car? And people who talk a lot, happy to be with people who talk a lot. So there's this trust leap that's happened in our society. So taking a risk to do something new is always crazy. Think about the first time that you took an Uber, the first time you did a Verbo. I mean, it's a game changer. So trust over time has changed. You know, at one time, face to face, it was local. It was very personal trust. It was your neighbor who was lending you money or making a decision about your land. You had to face them every day. They knew your parents. Your kids knew one another. You're very close and very personal. And then in the mid 1800s, that changed to be more institutional and became more and more institutional. You know, the little banks became bigger banks, became giant banks, and everything became not a personal trust, but a contractual trust. And that's a world that we're evolving out of now. And we're coming into this distributed trust. It's peer-to-peer. And how with peer-to-peer, everything changes. We get to do ratings. I got stuck on a plane, had to go into another city and get an Uber. The Uber driver that I got last week came to the car came to pick me up with all the windows down and the air blowing. And it had a little remaining smell. I'm like, okay, maybe not. We're driving away. I should have said no. And about 20 minutes from my home, he lit up something in the car that wasn't a cigarette and took a big puff and put it away. I'm like, what's that smell? Oh, it's always smelly in this area. They grow a lot of cannabis. And I spent a day, do I turn it in? I'm like, yeah, I really need to. So I was pretty close to 1 star to 2 star, and he was taken care of. You know, so when you leave an Airbnb or a Vrbo, you know, it always looks pretty nice for us. At the hotel, doesn't look as bad as the one picture, but pretty close. And it's because they rate you and you rate them. And that's the distributed trust. And that's a change in our world, how we do things. And so this trust shift it's like the internet welcomed the information age. Distributed trust is revolutionize how we trust and how we deal with that. And some of the key points so fit SCCS, and those are how we redesign systems and communications to deal with it. We've got to be accountable, we got to be transparent, and we got to be inclusive. That means you got to talk and you got to have a conversation. And I know that's something that's difficult for some people. Be accountable. We got to be on the forefront and decarbonize. We know we have to. We must be there. We got to be transparent. We got to share our data and information with the public. Let them see what's happening. And we need to be inclusive. We must invite the public to have a say in how we're doing it. Because in the end of the day, they're going to, so you might as well invite them and set it up that way. So that's my part of the show. And so the rest is up to you to ask questions. We're almost at that time. And if you want to get my contact information, because I didn't put it on here, you can just scan this QR and it'll get us going.
Awesome.
All right, Sarah, how do we do time
We
wise?
did great. We're at 12:27, so that's perfect.
Oh, I got
So,
3 more minutes. I got
do
3
you
more
want to
minutes.
talk? Do you want to
No,
talk for 3 more?
no, I want to answer questions.
Okay, Doc. All right. Well, we'd like to move over to Q&A sort of discussion. It's hard with the number of people on the line, but what I'd like to ask folks to do is to use that raise hand button. So down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you don't see it, just move your mouse around and it should pop up and then disappear. But click on raise hand. It'll suddenly move your name up to the top of the list, so I'll be able to tell, and then I'll be able to unmute you, and then you can ask your question. So while we're waiting for folks to think about that and figure out where that raise hand button is, I'll ask the first question. So yeah, you ended and you spoke a lot about trust and how you have to earn it. And I guess when we're talking about CCS projects and the organizations that are involved in CCS projects, what kinds of organizations are trusted and how does that vary geographically? And based on that, then how do you change what you're doing?
That's such a good question because there's no really one answer for it. So if you're looking at major oil companies, I mean, if you're of one political persuasion, you trust them because you've trusted them all life. If you're another, you don't trust them because they're big and that they're in fossil fuels. So that's really tough. So that means that they need to earn the respect of a larger group in the middle. And they earn that respect by being transparent, by being accountable, talking about what they're doing and trying not to hide it. Because the one thing that the public looks for now is people hiding things. What are they not telling me? What should I be scared of? I mean, the internet is a place where we go to get scared. And we need to be enough transparent and share with people. And when you admit that there's an issue, and there's going to be an issue at some point that you will deal with, but it's worth doing it to go forward. That's why we do that integrity check. And the other is they're going to find out anyway, so why not tell them?
And can you talk a little bit about the geographical differences that you see too?
Oh yeah. So working on the East Coast and West Coast, in most places pretty similar. There's a lot of desire in those areas to get rid of fossil fuel in a lot of ways, but not at the levels you would think. I mean, as you saw in the study, natural gas is very favored. People were really excited. And in the Southeast and a little closer through the Southeast and through some of the states in the Midwest, they're looking for answers. So we've worked on projects where our message is that to continue to use natural gas to create energy and electricity, we need to do carbon capture and storage so we can have cleaner energy production. And by doing that, we can continue to use cost-effective natural gas. And that brings people. In other places, it is to fight climate change, and that's all they want us to talk about. But in some places in the Southeast, if you talk about climate change, they don't even want to have a conversation with you. So we get the same result, same true north, the same idea, but how you talk to the people, you talk to them with their language.
Awesome.
And then the other, I think, is who's helping us, who's with us. So when you look at the type of people that they listen to, and with this being Stanford, just to let you know that I've put Stanford almost as a credible source in almost every study we do, because it just Stanford or one of the Ivies, but I like Stanford because you are looking at these issues. So if you do a major local university, they may be hitting 70% credibility, which is crazy. I mean, that's crazy. But Stanford, no matter where we go, is somewhere between 65 and 70. So local major university. And then, a scientist, a known scientist is up there in the 60s. Uh, Food and Water Watch nationwide is always floating around with 50 to 60, which is good. Sierra Club's lower. And then when you get to the groups that a lot of companies go after, and this is a warning, like my local Chamber of Commerce. I mean, such a mixed bag these days around the country that it can go down to the 20s. So, I mean, the universities, when we're working with the build out of wireless network, it was very similar. The closer local universities and then the big name universities that people trusted. So go win friends that have big degrees.
Okay. I do want to open it up to anyone on the call to raise your hand and ask a question. I'm a little concerned because I'm not seeing any raised hand signs. What I'm wondering is
Is it
if
working?
maybe that's not working. Could someone type in the chat and let me know if it's working, or I don't want to call on someone, but I'm wondering if someone could just try to raise their hand or type something in the chat, just so I know if it's working. All right, I see some hands are being raised now. Now what I don't know is if that was for real or if that was just for fun. So it looks like the raise hand thing does work. Michael Hardiman, your hand is still raised. So if you do have a question, what I will do is, I guess your hand is no longer still raised.
Oh, he needs to make up a question anyway.
All right, so it looks like the raised hand function works, but no one has a question. I'll just wait for another minute just to see if anyone else had some things they want to talk about, things that are of concern. I will pose some questions to the audience as well. Okay, Michael, I see you have raised your hand, and I will allow you to talk.
All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I was simply testing the function, but I'll brave with a question as well. Do we have data or information to know to provide insight as to whether or not when we talk about carbon capture, do we find that people are afraid of the concept?
Yes, if they're afraid of the concept. They have a fear of it because they don't know what it is. And we live in a time that the unknown is dangerous. Unknown is dangerous, and that's why if you don't reach out and tell them they don't need to be afraid, someone else will, and they will stand. So yeah, I mean the whole idea. Wait a minute. First off, I really don't know what carbon is, and you're taking this thing called CO2, which scares me, and you're going to put it into the ground next to my water supply or underground near my ranch or under my city. So there's a what I would expect is a natural fear that we need to deal with.
All right.
Great. Okay. I see we have a question from Sean Brennan.
Yes, can you hear me? I think I unmuted.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I have a slightly different question. So I'm a research geologist at the USGS. I don't necessarily, I'm not trying to sell CO2 storage. I need to convey the science that I do to a host of different audiences. And sometimes I find that scientists are great talking to each other and terrible talking to non-scientists. So I struggle with trying to convey my science in a way that's understandable and gets to the point. It's not that we don't do storytelling. We kind of need to fit our work into a story to convey it. But I find that the things that I think are straightforward are suddenly not. So you said specifically one thing about how people are afraid that you're going to put CO2 in the ground. I've found that the concept of the ground is confusing to people, and trying to explain that the CO2 is going, like, it's not the ground, it's a kilometer and a half, it's a mile down from where you are. I can't say kilometer, it's a mile down from where you are. It's deeper than, several Empire State Buildings below here. And even the concept of what that is, you have to explain. It's not the dirt that is in your soil. It becomes rock, and we're looking at something else. And then they get confused about rock and how do you put it in rock? We're like, well, there's little holes in them. So I realize that even in trying to tell my science, to explain my science, I have to tell a story of what the ground is.
Yeah.
I don't know what my question is. I just struggle with trying to convey this information in a different way. So I'm not selling the we need to store CO2. I'm just explaining what it is, and that
Right.
becomes difficult.
Well, I think you hit at the hardest part, Sean. That is the storage. And wait a minute, you're drilling a mile down. How does that work? And then isn't it, if you put it in, isn't it just going to rise up? Well, isn't it a gas? Well, no, we turn it into a semi-liquid. Well, whoa. Does that get in my water supply? Isn't that where our water comes from? Yes, but we go well below that. Well, but it goes through that. Am I giving the problems bad enough that you face? I mean, so what
Yeah.
I think it's the hardest part for us in sharing the story. And it's the part that we do at the graduate level with people, meaning once they get it, once they're over the other part, we go to it. And then we can show them, if we show them the rock cover, the rock cover that you go through, that's, two times as big as the Empire State Building. And when you show how big it is, and then you do take that rock formation. I saw some good conversation last year at your conference, Sarah. And we've done this, you put the rock out in your hand, you pour water on it, and you hold it up. And the water doesn't go through it. And they're like, oh, I get it. And then what happens to it? I mean, that's where your story comes in. What does it become? Where is it going? Well, the other story we find in our research and conversations is that's where we find it. That's where the CO2 comes from. In many cases, coming up with fossil fuels, and that's where we put it back. And so telling that story with you don't have to persuade anyone. You're just teaching. I want your job. Please, if people get scared, they don't go away and take my client down. But if they get scared, you just can be able to talk about it and get those analogies. The analogies are really, really important. And that's the idea. We're putting it back where it came from.
Yeah, that's what I usually fall back on is I talk to them, well, oil and gas comes from the ground, way below the ground. Well, this CO2 is like that, and we'll put it in a similar place in the ground. But yeah. I have to make sure I go. The other thing is going into the conversation with that mindset, and that
right.
that pre-thought and planning is not
right.
always in place. And I might be projecting just myself. It's not always in place. But I find that hearing other conversations, people don't come in with the right mind. The scientists don't go in with the right mindset of how they need to explain something to someone because they haven't had to have that conversation before.
But think about these famous people that are Mr. Scientist on TV and taught things. I mean, you just got to put that hat on, how they did that so well. And, that they'd have the TV shows. And then my favorite kids book was The Magic School Bus, where Miss Frizzle could explain anything. How does a water treatment facility work? And I actually called and got the rights to use some of their stuff for a water treatment facility issue we dealt with. Because she just made it simple and went off in the school bus inside the water treatment facility. And you just keep asking your questions. So, okay, maybe as a scientist, I'm not answering this. I got to go into some more detail. So I think that's part of it. Keep saying, let me share a little more in the short time. I think we have some other questions. So
yeah, we do. But I was writing down that magic school bus idea. I love that magic school bus for CCS, and we need Mrs. Frizzle here.
Let's do it. Let's write it.
All right. We have a question that has come in through the written form. So I'm just going to read it out loud because I'm not sure if everyone can see it or not. But one situation we're seeing in the CCS area is external organizations coming into local communities and churning up emotion and fear. I'm curious if you have any specific approaches when dealing with much larger, more organized, and in some cases very well-funded entities operating in local communities.
Yeah, you hit the magic numbers, more organized and more funded. And so if you notice that what we named our 6 steps, it was called the First Impression Program. And if you can get there first and tell your story and do it in the manner, in listening, coming up with a message where you acknowledge first, if you can do that, you can do it for less money and with less effort. And you can inoculate, saying there are groups who just don't want us to continue to use fossil fuels, and they're going to fight us at every level, and they're going to come and they're going to share. So inoculate for that coming. It's a really important part of when we finish the focused interview research, we finish with the very last thing we do is messaging. We have a core message, we have sub messages, and then inoculation messages. So knowing that there's going to be a number of tough issues for us, dangers that we need to deal with in the messaging and strategy. With those, we write positive, proactive messages for each of those. And so that's how we go about it and try to get there first. And surprisingly, it's the biggest problem usually is on the side trying to do this isn't just a resource issue or people issue. It's an audacity issue. Or do you have the audacity to really tell your story? And what happens is you don't until you're trying to come back and fight someone fighting you. And that's where the problem gets worse and worse. Corporate boards don't want to talk about it. And that's why projects are having a lot of trouble and not going forward.
Awesome. Okay. All right. We have a question on from Ramsey Hamid. So Ramsey, I just unmuted you. Please ask your question.
Okay, thank you. I guess on the theme of what we're talking about earlier in regards to injecting carbon into the ground and some of the concerns that some folks have there, one of the questions I have working in IT in the low carbon space is not so much the injection and the potential leaks of it going into the ground, but the actual transport of getting it to the actual storage site, and of a potential leak along maybe certain segments of the pipeline that don't have metering stations or monitoring stations, and the potential impact of first responders as they respond to that, or communities that could potentially get a massive carbon leak. And I guess where I'm going is the question is, are you aware of any carbon leak detection sensors that are being installed on pipelines that could be used by support organizations to detect those leaks quicker and then alerting the appropriate folks in the communities?
Well, I know there is for natural gas. So, but before I do want to acknowledge that that's a very tough issue in a fight. I mean, as you know, in California, that the state wants to decarbonize, but they're outlawing CO2 pipelines. And so we don't have any way to get it there. So that's a way of shutting down something without shutting it down that we have to fight. So I can't imagine there's not monitoring. Everything else we've done with natural gas pipelines, all the advances made in pipelines, and you got to show them. You got to tear the pipeline apart. You got to show we've earned approval for a number of pipelines in the last few years where people just aren't getting them done. You got to show what the pipeline looks like. You got to do a cutaway of the pipeline. You got to show the sensors in the pipeline. You got to show the shutoff valves in the pipeline, and deal with it moving through. And then, so what happens if the CO2 broke loose a little bit? What would your answer be if that was a question at a community meeting?
So one way of detecting it potentially would be you would detect the pressure, like there would be a drop in pressure
Constantly. Yeah.
Yes.
And if a little bit got out, what would be the conversation?
If a little bit got out, I don't know. That's a tricky one. Like if it was a small leak, maybe you wouldn't detect it, or I don't know.
Right,
and that's why I was curious.
What would it do? What would it do to someone? That's always the issue.
But yeah, a small leak, I don't know. A massive leak could be a problem.
Yeah. I mean, if you ask about what happens if it gets into a water area, what happens if some CO2 got in, and there's been a whole bunch of videos and things. We haven't used them because we haven't had to, where they show what happens if you inject a little CO2 in the water in a room, and you get some bubbly water. It doesn't taste as good. Not going to kill you.
Yeah, the water I'm not worried about. I'm worried about pipelines that maybe are close to communities, right? So
yeah. So you got to deal with, first off, what is carbon? What's CO2? Yeah,
CO2,
yeah. So what we're breathing it out right now. The plants are sucking it in, and it's a necessary part of the carbon cycles and necessary part of our life. That changes the worry about CO2. And if you don't talk about it, it just becomes, CO2 becomes just pure poison. Well, it can't become pure poison when we breathe it out.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So in my hypothetical scenario, it would be a massive leak that that people are sleeping in their homes, and all of a sudden there's
Right.
reports
no,
of
no smell.
yeah.
And no smell because it's not injected with deodorant. So the deal is that's where you're going to be watching the pressure. I mean, the technology is there for everything else. I've not had faced this with any of our CCS clients, and as they've been closer to where they're collecting and storing. That's, by the way, that's one of the nice things to have.
So
Yeah, I
we
appreciate that insight.
We actually have kind of a related question that's in the written questions, and it's about fighting against misinformation on social media when it comes to the safety of CO2 pipeline operations and development. So there was an incident in Mississippi a couple of years ago where there was a pipeline leak.
Right.
And then afterwards, there has been some misinformation on that. So rather than focusing so much on the pipeline side of things, how do we deal with misinformation, especially with social media? And especially with pertaining to the safety of CO2 transport or even storage or even capture.
First, getting into an ugly fight on social media as the direct proponent of a project is not good. I mean, you're always going to lose. There's hundreds and hundreds of people on there that, I mean, half of them don't care about the issue, but they care about fighting with someone. They're angry and hostile, looking for a cause, and you come along and they're going to take you down. Having a third party that works with you, again, the credible messengers with the universities and expert scientists being there, and they carefully take apart that argument from the Mississippi. Right. So there's this many CO2 projects, there's this many CO2 pipelines going on, and this did happen, and this were the results. So this was a big accident, and there was very little really at the end results from it, and it's not common. And first, let's talk about what CO2 is. If you leave your windows closed at night, your room fills up with CO2. You've got to understand what it is, and too much of it can be dangerous, like many things. But that's so that Food and Water Watch spends a lot of time on that case study, and then you just got to move off it. So that when we get into these things, you have your agenda of debate. These are the things you want to talk about. These are the things that those who want to fight with you, which is it's a scam. We don't need it. It doesn't work. It's just a scheme to keep using fossil fuels. And they had this accident. If we go over to their agenda debate and spend all our time there, we lose. And we got to go over here and tell our story and continue to tell our story. We have to deal with it if it gets big. But that's why, for us, we do not suggest in the energy field that we play in the social media area, that we don't put up our own websites, our own social media sites, put up our own websites. We'll do digital media and drive them places. And, we have one California producer that we work with, and they've been on social media a long time, and we do it for them. And we do short videos, we do stuff. We get amazing response, but it's in communities where they're loved. And that's what we're targeting. And that's some of the rules. Well, I have to do social media because I got to be there. Okay, well, let's figure out who we're talking to. But social media is, please, it's like a hellhole that we just don't want to go to.
Okay, we've got another question that came in through the written form. Is it more effective to work with a technical team and engineers to learn to tell stories, or should we bring in professional storytellers to convey the technical message? Which approach is more successful to get groups talking?
Well, it's to teach the engineers and the scientists to do it. If you can, and it depends on the person. We work with one of the major oil companies. They had a bunch of locals doing stuff, and a bunch of top level guys in the public affairs side, and they all said, okay, the project's going, we're going back to headquarters, and they nominated a pipeline engineer to be the spokesperson. And we worked with her for one session, speaker training for a day. 2 weeks later, there was a spill, and they had just purchased this whole old facility. There's a spill someplace. They didn't even know there was a pipeline from the old facility. And she handled the media. And her ability to talk to the media She was a natural, but just a little bit of training. Our post crisis polling, most memorable thing is the woman with the company hat on, who was so well spoken with a smile on her face. I always felt I could trust her. I mean, profound. And so I want to train an engineer to be a spokesperson. And I've trained some people in other industries to be the spokesperson, be out there. And a lot of it in big commercial development, huge hotel things, one of the most. And he he became a competitor, started his own company. He's an amazing player because he knew everything from the construction side or the engineering side, in the case he wasn't an engineer, and he could tell the story in a whole better way. So give me an engineer, give me a couple days, but they don't always have time. That's the challenge.
Okay, and we have another question. It might be from the same person in the chat. So you've talked about how, yeah, bring in an engineer and train an engineer to be able to communicate to the public. But what happens when your scientist or your engineer comes in and they tells us how it can be done safely and the right way and all of that? But how do we know that when the project is actually up and running, that it will be done safely? How can we then trust the company when they're actually doing it?
Well, I mean, the companies have records. I mean, we've had people on from some very reputable companies that have asked questions here. And those who are going to hate one of the major oil and gas players, I mean, we're not going to convince them to like you, but they're not going to be in that conversation. So we need to show the credibility because we understand the danger. We acknowledge the impact, and then we contrast to what we're doing. You have instant credibility, and then what are we going to do? So being transparent and being accountable, as I said, under the trust. And under those, what is it that we're worried about, and how can I watch it and measure it? I mean, is there a means for me to get you publish monthly reports? Is there a means for me to see what's happening in certain parts of the operation on a daily basis online? And we've done that in mining, where we're going to let people see what's happening. This is what's going on. This is what we're doing. And you can read what's being used and how it's being used. It's not that hard. I mean, the company's going to track it. Why can't we share it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Okay, I am not seeing any more questions in the chat. I don't see any hands raised. This is sort of a last call for any final questions. And if we don't have any, then I'm going to take a moment to thank John for speaking with us today. You have given us sort of a template that I think all of us can think about and use as we are talking with the public. It gives me a different thought process to go through before any sort of engagement, which is really kind of cool. So thank you for that toolkit. And thank you for sharing with us your thoughts today. So thanks.
If you have any other questions, just email me. Happy to answer anything. And thank you all for being on. What an honor to speak with Stanford on this. So Sarah, thank you.
Thank you.